Welcome back to Maple Murders. In Episode 2, we investigate the dark story of a man who hid in plain sight. To his clients, he was just Bruce, the friendly landscaper who made gardens in Toronto's wealthiest neighborhoods beautiful. To kids at the local mall, he was Santa Claus, a jolly man with a warm smile. He was a grandfather, a small business owner, a seemingly harmless man hiding in plain sight. But that was a carefully built facade. Beneath it, a monstrous secret was growing. In the shadows of Toronto's gay village, a vibrant and close-knit community, Bruce McArthur was a predator. He was a calculating serial killer who preyed on the vulnerable, twisting the very systems that were supposed to protect them. This is the story of his reign of terror. A story not just of his horrific crimes, but of the devastating police failures that let him kill for years, and the painful trauma inflicted on a community that had to fight for its own justice. It all started quietly, with a gnawing unease. In the fall of 2010, friends of Skandaraj Navaratnam started to worry. The 40-year-old was a popular, kind man in Toronto's gay village. In early September, he vanished. He was last seen leaving a nightclub, and he'd left his dog behind, something his friends swore he would never do. They reported him missing, but it was treated as just another case. Just a few months later, in late December 2010, the pattern repeated. Abdulbasir Faizi, a 42-year-old from Afghanistan who was secretly exploring his sexuality in the village, disappeared. His car was later found abandoned near a property on Mallory Crescent, a detail that wouldn't become important for years. His family was deeply concerned and reported him missing. Then, 2 years later, in October 2012, 58-year-old Majeed Kayhan also vanished. Like the others, he was a man of South Asian descent with deep ties to the gay village. 3 men, all with similar backgrounds, all connected to the same neighborhood, had disappeared. The community's worry turned into fear. Were these just tragic coincidences, or was something much more sinister happening? People in the village were convinced it was the latter. They believed a predator was stalking their streets, targeting men who were vulnerable because of their race, immigration status, or closeted lives. In response, the Toronto Police Service launched Project Houston in November 2012 to investigate the disappearances of all 3 men. The community's serial killer theory was on the table, but so was the idea that the men had just left on their own. The investigation dragged on for months, with no real leads. During that investigation, however, a name came up that should have changed everything. In 2013, detectives from Project Houston identified and interviewed Bruce McArthur. He was connected to some of the missing men and was active on the same dating apps. Police questioned him, but only as a witness, not a suspect. They searched his devices but found what they considered no direct evidence of a crime, so they let him go. They saw him as a dead end. In reality, he was the monster they were looking for, and they had just let him walk out the door. The investigation was eventually wound down, leaving a community terrified and a killer free to hunt again. The years after Project Houston quietly ended were tense. While law enforcement went silent, the disappearances continued. Soroush Mahmudi, a 50-year-old immigrant from Iran, was reported missing in August 2015. Then there was Dean Lisowick, a 47-year-old who struggled with homelessness. He was last seen in 2016, but wasn't reported missing until a year later. Kirushna Kumar Kanagaratnam, a 37-year-old asylum seeker from Sri Lanka, also vanished around 2016. His disappearance went unreported for years, a perfect example of the vulnerability McArthur exploited. These men were fathers, brothers, and friends, but their cases didn't trigger the alarm they should have. The community, though, saw the pattern with horrifying clarity. Men, often men of color, immigrants, or those living on the margins, were being erased from their neighborhood. They pleaded with police, held vigils, and posted flyers, their voices a desperate cry for help. They knew a serial killer was in their midst. The police response during this time created a deep and lasting resentment. Instead of acknowledging the community's legitimate fears, officials publicly downplayed them. In December 2017, as fear in the village hit a breaking point, Toronto Police Chief Mark Saunders held a press conference. He stated flatly that there was no evidence of a serial killer. He claimed the cases weren't linked and called the now-defunct Project Houston an excellent investigation. To the community, these words were a slap in the face. It felt like their reality was being denied by the very people sworn to protect them. Activists accused the police of incompetence, and worse, of systemic homophobia and racism. They argued the disappearances weren't taken seriously because the victims were gay and often racialized. The police, it seemed, were either unable or unwilling to see the pattern that was so obvious to everyone else. This created a chasm of distrust, a wound that only grew deeper as the true horror of what was happening began to surface. Long before Bruce McArthur became a household name, he was on the police's radar. Not once, but multiple times. The investigation is a story of missed chances and ignored red flags that had fatal consequences. The most glaring failure happened in June 2016, a full 18 months before McArthur was finally arrested. A man who met McArthur online went to his apartment. The encounter quickly turned violent. The man told police that McArthur grabbed him by the throat and started strangling him. Terrified, the man fought him off, escaped, and immediately called 911. Police arrived and arrested McArthur. They had him in custody. They had a victim, a witness, describing a violent, unprovoked attack. It was the perfect chance to stop a predator. But they blew it. In a decision that is still baffling, McArthur was released without charges just hours later. An internal review later found that the investigating officer, Sergeant Paul Gauthier, failed to follow basic procedures. He didn't take a video statement from the victim or photograph his injuries in a timely manner. All crucial evidence. Sergeant Gauthier was later charged with neglect of duty, but was ultimately found not guilty of misconduct. The result was a catastrophe. McArthur, who had just tried to strangle a man in a way that was chillingly similar to how he killed his victims, was allowed to walk free. He would go on to murder at least 3 more men: Dean Lisowick, Andrew Kinsman, and Selim Essen. Their deaths were preventable. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a systemic breakdown that raised serious questions about how Toronto police investigated violent crimes, especially against the LGBTQ+ community. Why wasn't the victim's account taken seriously? This wasn't the only missed chance. In 2014, concerns about his behavior were raised at the PWA Foundation, a local aid service organization, and of course, there was the 2013 interview during Project Houston. Each of these moments was a point in time where lives could have been saved. Critics argue that a toxic mix of homophobia and racism led investigators to view the victims and witnesses through a distorted lens, downplaying the seriousness of the violence. These weren't just oversights. They were symptoms of a deeper problem that allowed Bruce McArthur to keep killing for years. By the spring of 2017, the fear that had been simmering for years in the gay village finally boiled over. 2 more men, both well-known and loved, had vanished. First was Selim Esen, a 44-year-old from Turkey. On April 14th, 2017, he disappeared. His friends knew immediately something was terribly wrong. 2 months later, Andrew Kinsman vanished. The 49-year-old was a building superintendent and a dedicated community volunteer. He was incredibly reliable. When he didn't show up for work, the alarm was sounded instantly and loudly. His friends and neighbors mobilized, plastering the neighborhood with posters and using social media to amplify their search. Kinsman's high-profile disappearance, combined with the community's relentless pressure, finally forced the police to act decisively. They couldn't deny the connections any longer. In August 2017, they launched a new task force, Project Prism, created specifically to investigate the disappearances of Esen and Kinsman. This time, the investigation felt different. It was better resourced and had a new sense of urgency. The breakthrough came from a single clue left by Andrew Kinsman himself. On his calendar for June 26th, the day he disappeared, investigators found one word: Bruce. It was a common name, but it was a lead. Detectives began the painstaking work of identifying every Bruce in Kinsman's life. Their search eventually led them to a 66-year-old landscaper, Bruce McArthur. He was the same man they'd interviewed and dismissed 4 years earlier. Now, he was their prime suspect. Police put him under covert surveillance, tracking his every move. They got another huge break when they located a red Dodge Caravan McArthur had recently sold to a scrapyard. They seized the vehicle just in time. After a forensic exam, they found Andrew Kinsman's blood inside. They also found traces of Selim Esen's DNA. The net was closing, and fast. Police knew they had their man. The only question now was how to catch him before he killed again. By January 2018, Project Prism was sure they were tracking a serial killer. The DNA from the minivan confirmed it. They had McArthur under constant surveillance, but they were in a race against time. They knew he was likely to strike again, and on the morning of January 18th, their fears came true. Surveillance teams watched as McArthur brought another man up to his 19th floor apartment. The police faced a terrible choice: go in too soon and risk him destroying evidence, or wait too long and let the man inside become the next victim. Fearing the worst, they made the call. They breached the apartment, and when McArthur opened the door, they pushed their way in. Inside, they found a scene of pure horror. A man was tied to the bed, terrified but alive, with a leather bag pulled over his head. The police had interrupted a murder in progress. By mere minutes, they had saved a man's life and caught one of Canada's most prolific serial killers. The evidence in his apartment was sickening. On his computer, they found a trove of horrific images. McArthur had meticulously documented his crimes, creating separate digital folders for each of his victims. The folders contained photos he'd taken after they were dead. He had posed the bodies, sometimes dressing them in a fur coat or placing an unlit cigar in their mouths. It was part of his ritual, a way to keep a trophy of his kill. Police also found a folder labeled with the name of the man they had just rescued. He had already been categorized, his folder waiting to be filled. But the most gruesome discovery was yet to come. The investigation led police to a quiet house on Mallory Crescent, where McArthur worked as a landscaper. For years, he'd used the large planter boxes in the backyard as his personal graveyard. Buried beneath the soil and flowers, forensic investigators began to unearth human remains. Over several weeks, in the cold of a Toronto winter, they carefully excavated the planters. They found the dismembered remains of at least 7 men: Andrew Kinsman, Salim Hussain, Skandaraj Navaratnam, Abdulbasir Faizi, Kirushna Kumar Kanagaratnam, Dean Lisowick, and Soroush Mahmudi. It was a charnel house, hidden in a suburban garden. Later, the remains of the 8th victim, Majeed Kayhan, were recovered from a ravine behind the same property. The full, awful truth was finally out. The arrest of Bruce McArthur sent a tremor of shock and horror through Toronto. The community that had lived in fear finally had a name for their terror, but this brought little comfort. Instead, it brought a wave of grief and anger. Grief for the 8 lives stolen, and rage at the system that had failed them so completely. McArthur was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence was overwhelming. The DNA, the photos, the near victim, and the horrific discoveries in the planters. A long, painful trial seemed certain. But on January 29th, 2019, McArthur did the unexpected. He pleaded guilty to all 8 counts of first-degree murder. The plea avoided a graphic trial, but it also meant McArthur would never have to publicly explain why he did what he did. His motives would remain a mystery. At his sentencing hearing, the court heard gut-wrenching victim impact statements. Friends and family spoke of the men they loved, of Skanda's infectious laugh, Andrew's kindness, Selim's gentle soul. The Crown described McArthur as a sexual sadist who killed for his own gratification and kept mementos from his victims, like jewelry and notebooks. On February 8, 2019, Justice John McMahon sentenced Bruce McArthur to life in prison, with no chance of parole for 25 years. He would be 91 years old before he could even apply for release. Justice McMahon called his crimes pure evil. For many, the sentence felt like a legal technicality that didn't match the scale of the loss. But for others, it was a form of closure. The man responsible was behind bars, and he would never harm anyone again. The conviction of Bruce McArthur didn't heal the wounds he left on Toronto's LGBTQ+ community. It just started the long process of dealing with the trauma and betrayal. The case was never just about one evil man. It was about the systemic failures that allowed him to hunt for a decade. For the people of the gay village, the case confirmed their worst fears about law enforcement. It dredged up decades of mistrust. The feeling wasn't just that the police failed to catch a killer, but that they failed to listen, care, or protect them because of who they were. This sense of abandonment left a deep psychological scar. The community demanded an independent inquiry. How could police interview a suspect and let him go? How could he be arrested for a violent assault and be released without charge? The inquiry, led by former Judge Gloria Epstein, released a report called Missing and Missed. It was a damning critique of the Toronto Police Service, finding that systemic discrimination, and serious flaws in how missing persons cases were handled contributed to the failures. The report made 151 recommendations for reform, focusing on building trust with marginalized communities. The case also forced a conversation about which victims matter. McArthur targeted men he believed wouldn't be missed: immigrants, refugees, the homeless, the closeted. Their marginalization was his weapon. The 8 men he murdered were Skandaraj Navaratnam, Abdulbasir Faizi, Majeed Kayhan, Soroush Mahmudi, Kirushna Kumar Kanagaratnam, Dean Lisowick, Salim Essen, and Andrew Kinsman. Their deaths were not inevitable. They were the result of a predator's evil meeting, a system's indifference. The legacy of Bruce McArthur is therefore twofold. It is a story of immense pain and loss, but it is also a story of resilience, of a community that refused to be silent, that mourned its dead while fighting for the living. It is a powerful demand for justice, not just for the 8 men whose lives were stolen, but for all vulnerable people whose voices are too often ignored. It is a demand that we must do better, that we must listen, and that we must never again allow a monster to hide in plain sight. The story of Bruce McArthur is a difficult but important one. If you found this documentary informative, please consider subscribing for more in-depth investigations. More importantly, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the police investigation and the community's response? Thank you for listening. It is through remembering cases like this, by honoring the victims and examining the failures, that we can hope to build a safer and more just society. The fight for that future continues, driven by the memory of those who were lost.